I wanted to reiterate the guidance of W.B. Du Bois in the concluding chapter of his classic book, Black Reconstruction in America, subtitled An Essay Toward a History of the Part Which Black Folk Played in the Attempt to Reconstruct Democracy in America, 1860 to 1880. And these were his words. But are these reasons of courtesy and philanthropy sufficient for denying truth? If history is going to be scientific, if the record of human history is going to be set down with that accuracy and faithfulness of detail which will allow its use as a measuring rod and guidepost for the future generations of nations, there must be set some standard of ethics in research and interpretation. If, on the other hand, we're going to use history for our pleasure and amusement, for inflating our national ego and giving us a false but pleasurable sense of accomplishment, then we must give up the idea of history either as a science or as an art using the results of science, and admit, frankly, that we are using a version of historic fact in order to influence and educate a new generation along the way.
Good evening, and welcome to the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. I'm Bob Perry, the museum's executive director. Until tonight, we'd never scheduled a talk in this space to begin and end before sunset, but it occurred to me recently, though, that never before have we approached a subject more in need of being seen in the light of day in this building, in this particular place. It's a great privilege to host tonight's speaker, Dr. Ronald Bailey, who will share with us his extensive research and integrative and longitudinal perspective on the elements of what he terms the slavery trade. I thank the Lowell Institute for their generous support of our Mill Talk series. Among their many extraordinary contributions to civic life in our region, the Lowell Institute has been making grants to support free lectures in Greater Boston since 1839 at such esteemed venues as the MFA, the Boston Public Library, the Boston Museum of Science, the JFK Library, the Old South Meeting House, and here at the Charles River Museum. We're privileged indeed to have this vital support. I also thank the WGBH Forum Network. They are recording this talk, and after a bit of post-production work, it will be shared with the world on their YouTube channel and website. The WGBH Forum Network is also made possible by the support of the Lowell Institute, which, by the way, was created by a bequest from John Lowell Jr., who was the firstborn son of Francis Cabot Lowell, and we're going to get to him in a moment. The quality and array of educational content that the GBH Forum Network makes available online is extraordinary, and I encourage you to explore and be inspired by all that is offered there. A couple of housekeeping items for you tonight. There's bottled water on the small table over there, and take a right at that car and turn left up a ramp and you'll find restrooms. Before I introduce Dr. Bailey, though, I'd like to see if I can put tonight's event into its unique and appropriate context. I hope that you'll forgive me for this longer than normal introduction. I discovered Dr. Bailey's work last fall through a journal article that I found online that he had penned some years back, and as soon as I read it, I knew he simply must speak in this place on this subject, and please allow me to explain. This museum's home was originally the Boston Manufacturing Company. It was founded in 1813 by Francis Cabot Lowell. One of his descendants is in the room tonight, by the way, and a number of his wealthy relatives, friends, and colleagues. And this textile mill was the first fully integrated textile mill in the world, which took raw cotton and turned it into whole cloth in one building, and that had never been done before. It immediately became the model for textile mills throughout New England, beginning with East Chelmsford in the early 1820s, a village that was renamed Lowell in 1826 after Francis Cabot Lowell himself. This really is the place where the tree of life of American industry burst through the ground a little over 2 centuries ago. That fact has amazed and inspired me, but educator that he is, Ronald Bailey, has taught me that I had and still have a lot more to learn about what really made it possible. You might not know that it was Francis Cabot Lowell's father, John Lowell, one of many John Lowells, the who's who of that family can be very confusing, who authored Article 1 of the Massachusetts Constitution, which effectively abolished slavery in this state in the late 1700s. That fact, slavery having no legal standing in Massachusetts, is something that unfortunately enables rationalization, facilitating arm's-length treatment of slavery when studying the history of the industrialization of New England, which happened chiefly through the textile industry early on. Well, of course, the cotton that this and other mills wove into cloth was produced by enslaved people in the American South, but we don't own any slaves ourselves, so our hands are clean. Well, that's the ostensibly exculpatory low-hanging fruit in any discussion of slavery in early New England industrial history and of the extraordinary building and concentrating of wealth in this region. What Dr. Bailey has done for us is to illuminate the subtler and more insidious indirect pathways to riches taken by many of the so-called Boston associates, the founders of this mill and a great many mills and related industries and entities that they found dead or supported, the many pathways to wealth and power that were essentially established and maintained by the slavery trade. We here at this museum have done an inadequate job of learning and owning these truths and of making them known to our audiences. I'm deeply grateful to Dr. Bailey for agreeing to join us tonight and to help us to begin to correct our course. Ronald W. Bailey is a professor in the Department of African American Studies at the University of Illinois, serving as department head from 2012 to 2022. He's a 1965 graduate of Evans County History School in Claxton, Georgia, and a 1969 Phi Beta Kappa graduate with a BA in liberal arts in cross-cultural studies from Michigan State University's Justin Morrill College. His undergraduate major included fluency in Russian and a certificate from Moscow State University. He holds an MA in political science from Stanford and a PhD in Black Studies from Stanford, one of the first such degrees awarded in the United States. He's taught at Fisk, Cornell, Northwestern, University of Mississippi, and Northeastern, where he chaired the Department of African American Studies for 8 years. He also served as Vice President for Academic Affairs at South Carolina State University and at Knoxville College, and as a senior scientist with the Education Department Center, Incorporated. Dr. Bailey's publications include Introduction to Afro-American Studies, a People's College Primer, Remembering Medgar Evers, For a New Generation, Let Us March On, Civil Rights Photographs of Ernest Withers, Jr., and Black Business Enterprise, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives. His articles have appeared in the Journal of Social Issues, Journal of Negro Education, Agricultural History, Review of Black Political Economy, Black Scholar, Souls, Critical Journey of Black Politics, Culture and Society, and the Journal of African American History. NSF and NEH grants supported the development of 2 website projects he initiated, dignubia.org, nubianet.org, and he was also co-founder of ACT Roxbury, where ACT stands for Art, Culture, and Trade, an organization that now operates the Roxbury Center for the Arts at Hibernia Hall and the Roxbury Film Festival. Dr. Bailey has consulted on museum, curriculum, and technology projects. He was also the principal investigator of a project funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services to build capacity in 6 African American museums in the Savannah area. He's currently co-principal investigator of a 6-year digital tools project called Afro Publishing Without Walls. I believe there's a flyer over there on that stool for you to take with you tonight, or Afro PWW2, funded for the past 6 years by the Mellon Foundation. Please welcome back to New England, Dr. Ronald Bailey.
Thank you, Bob. With that generous introduction, I think I should stop while I'm ahead. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I spent a good 20 years in the Boston area at Northeastern, and this talk tonight kicks off my campaign to finish the book that I should have finished when I started working on it some time ago. I want to thank Dr. Perry and the museum for this invitation. When he extended the invitation, he said I could choose it any date between Juneteenth and July 4th. So the juxtaposition of the now institutionalized celebration of the date when enslaved people in Texas got word that the emancipation had been signed for 2 years earlier, and the other bookend being, I think, when I think of July 4th, I think of Frederick Douglass's comment, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" where he tries to bring to the public attention how the Black community was feeling about that commemoration. And for many months, I have worried that we were facing the end of affirmative action, so the Supreme Court decision today as additional impetus to this discussion. I want to focus on 3 things in my talk today. First, sharing a few words about the framework I have used for many years, many decades of teaching to try to convey more of American history and Afro history to my students. I have a PhD in Black Studies from Stanford and a lifelong commitment to what we called academic excellence and social responsibility. Yes, get the good grades, get the A, get the Phi Beta Kappa Chi, but always think about what you can contribute to the larger society. The second thing I want to talk about is the imperative that we study intellectual history in general and African American intellectual history in particular. I want to talk about this place and the connections to the story I'm telling as a 3-act play. Just like you don't go to a play and just see Act 1 and think you got the whole thing, or you don't come in at Act 3 thinking you understand it all. You know, if it's the 3-act play, you need all 3 acts. And that's the tool I'm using, the analogy I'm using in telling the story of what I call the slavery trade as a 3-act engagement. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. I'll take a little deep detour from the story of the slavery trade in this area, kind of a southern detour back to where I'm from originally, Claxton, Georgia, which is 50 miles inland from Savannah. And it was on a plantation that Nathaniel Greene was awarded by the new government in appreciation for his role in the American Revolution. And so it was at Mulberry Grove where Eli Whitney went to prepare to take his law exam, where the cotton gin was invented. And so I dropped the cotton gin story in the middle of this story of the textile revolution. And then I'll close with some comments about what all of this might mean with the thing that I often try to get my students to think about: what happened then, what's happening now, and what needs to happen next. So I have prepared, I loved how well they did this poster. I love my picture on that. So one of the things that I talk to my classes about is tools. This is my grandfather, Charlie Bailey. The one time I got a serious spanking from him was when I went out into his tool house and started messing with he was a carpenter. And I started messing around with his saws and hammers and stuff. And he spanked me and said, "Boy, don't you know I earn my living with those tools, so you don't play with those." So I often go to class when I'm introducing tools for critical thinking to my students, and I'll pull out that power saw that you see there and stand up on the table and turn it on. And you know, that wakes all the students up and gets them to thinking, who is this crazy guy who's going to, but they leave knowing what I'm trying to get them to think about. Tools for thinking seriously about what's going on. So what are the 3 tools we're going to talk about? The first tool is called the paradigm of unity. The second tool looks at three environments, and the third tool looks at science, ideology, and action, or knowing, feeling, and doing. And I'll say a little bit about each one of those. Okay. This is the paradigm of unity. It's a simple matter of a timeline across the top, alternating periods of social cohesion and social disruption, beginning in Africa, disrupted by the slave trade, slavery, disrupted by emancipation, rural, disrupted by migration, and urban. And I really should have another column there where I put a question mark, because I'm always pushing the kids to think about, what does all of this mean? Where is all of this headed? So that's one piece of it. The other piece is units of analysis. And what I'm trying to do there is introduce kind of a definition of the Black experience or the human experience. And so we've come up with 6 categories: color, class, culture, consciousness, gender, and age, or 6 factors. And I think somewhere you'll see me having a question mark. Are there other things that should be added? And so students come back and talk about how they would revise this. And so if you look at that as a grid, that gives us a very rich environment to start provoking thought and consideration and more, more thinking about what all of this means. And so the color, class, culture, consciousness was our approach to talking about every human experience having biology, political economy, society, consciousness, gender, and age. And there you see my admonition, should we add other categories to that? And this is another way I've come up with thinking about this, and that's to encourage my students to think about the knowledge we're going to explore in the study of the Black experience as file cabinets. And each file cabinet is labeled Africa, slave trade, slavery, emancipation, rural migration, and urban. And the vertical is color, class, culture, consciousness, gender, and age. So I want them collecting the information we're talking about and filing it away and referring back to it as we move through the discussion. And all of these factors operate simultaneously at the same time. So when the human experience is more complex than rocket science, frankly, is how I want them to think about it. So just as one example, the article I picked up June 19th from the New York Times, the racial wage gap is shrinking, though still enormous. The gap has shrunk over the past 5 years. In the early 2000s, the wage gap between Black and white, so forth and so on. But this is what that paradigm encourages the students to do, to collect the data, collect pieces of information, and to think about where that fits in. The second tool is called the 3 environments: the natural environment, the human environment, and the built environment. And let me give you a few. So this was a fascinating discovery. 71% of the total cotton harvest in the United States happens north of 30 degrees latitude, right? And I'm from Savannah, 32.1. New Orleans has a 30.2, right? So this introduces the students to the fact that the evolution of the earth was such that certain regions could support certain crops. So cotton is the one that I'm interested in. And I was stunned when I read this and discovered, oh, that's why so much cotton stuff goes on in the U.S. South. We can talk more about that. A second example is a quote from a newspaper. I think it was a French or an English journalist says, everybody here is talking about cotton and niggers and cotton. This is 1860. And I use this because if you look at the darker areas on the left, this is cotton production in 1860, and on the right, it is the percent slaves in the population. You can see that the distribution of where slaves are working is consistent with the same pattern in terms of where cotton was grown. I also have a point here about human evolution, and I wanted to put that in because I used to tell my students, if during the course of the semester I'm teaching you, there's not a new discovery about human evolution and, skeletons being found, so forth and so on, right, I'd give you a pizza party. And I did this for several years and never had to give a pizza party, because every month or so we're seeing new discoveries of archaeologists around the world. So this helps them situate another piece of the human story that we need to pay attention to. Another example is how the evolution of the Earth and continents and so on, the natural history of the Earth, resulted in ocean currents and wind currents that, in this instance, explains why the slave trade could come about. Now, I'm in class talking about this, and one of my students came and said, Dr. Bailey, I think I could do you a GIF that shows what you're talking about. And so this was, I don't know, a decade ago, but this freshman student did this, and it was just a way of getting students to visualize what I'm presenting to them. And if it was fully active, you can run a cursor over it and see the wind currents. And the last piece is important because of science. It's theory of meteorology. And I use that to get them to think about meteorology as a science and what it does for us thinking about how this applies really to human beings. I have I'd love to assign them forensic movies, CSI. Why are they being so careful collecting the evidence and so on? What is that? They're trying to avoid bias and so on. So again, here you just see a simple way of presenting students with some tools that they could use to become more critical, more scientific in their thinking. Okay, so the story, let's see here, did I jump ahead? Okay, so this is the story I want to tell you. And I usually do this at the end, but I'm going to do this in the beginning. This is a chart I created from some sources. And the first column has the number of slaves beginning in 1790 going to 1860. And the second column is the percent increase, and then cotton produced, percent increase, cotton exported. And what you see here in 1790, 697,000 slaves that had grown to 3.9 million by 1860. And in each one of those columns, you see phenomenal increases, right, over each decade. And then you get to the percent exported. Then on the second row, exports to Great Britain, and you can see the U.S. beginning in 1780, 83% of the U.S. cotton is 83%? 53%. So that's what the columns do. And the most interesting column is probably the last column, because there you see the gradual increase in the amount of cotton that was being consumed by U.S. industry in the burgeoning textile industry. So that's a little busy, but that's the point. This last column, you'll see the percent increase in U.S. consumption going from 37% to 100%, 96, 36, 163, 132. So you see this phenomenal increase in cotton is now being consumed by the textile mills like the one we're in today, okay? Probably a result of the friction with the British after in the War of 1812 and so forth. And I mean, I looked at this recently, and this is a pretty good representation of the story I'm trying to convey in this work. So one of the ways I'm trying to tell the story is, as I said, as a 3-act play. So Act 1 is from the dark Middle Ages of Europe's medieval feudalism to the first global system between 800 and 1644. And, we've all studied, feudalism and the serfs and the lords and so on. But most students who take my classes know of a crazy play by a movie by Martin Lawrence, right? Caught some of you laughing, right? It's called Black Knight. And it's a spoof, but it helps me to talk to them about what was going on in the period of feudalism. I think at one point he says, a rebellion against an evil king. He probably says evil ass king, but I edited that out. The point I'm trying to get to, is mercantilism. And this is a quote from Malachi Postlethwayt in 1745, who was a leading British economist. He says, "Are we not indebted to those valuable people, the Africans, for our sugars, tobaccos, rice, rum, and all other imports into our colonies from Africa? And will not the exportation of British manufacturers among the Africans be in proportion, they being paid for in such commodities only?" I also try to get my students to think about how you're going to title your book. And so that's where the title of the book comes from. Those valuable people, the Africans, comes from Postlethwayt. And what I want to do is get them to think about the rise of the global economy. And so here is a picture of the period of political fragmentation, Black Death. I think I have a misspelling there. When 40 to 50% of the European population died during the period called the Black Death. I have here is one of Europe's problem solvers. This is Pope Urban II in 1095, who kicked off the Crusades. This land you inherit, which you inhabit, is too narrow for your large population, nor does it abound in wealth. Hence it is what you lead you to murder one another, that when wage war, perish from mutual wounds. Let therefore hatred depart from among you. Let your quarrels end. Let war cease. Let all dissensions and controversies slumber. Enter upon the road to the holy sepulchre, wresting that land from the wicked race and subject it yourselves. So that's a part of this story as well. Here's another problem solver. This is Prince Henry the Navigator, who was, I think when he was 13 or 14 years old, you know, they would normally have kids doing jousting and games. Queen Philippa, his mother, said, let that boy do something serious. So they sent the largest armada ever to sail from Portugal across the Mediterranean to attack Sorsta in 1450. My point is that this becomes the beginning of Europe's involvement in the global order that was developing, and he became the master of the Order of Christ in 1415. It's also interesting to try to understand what else was going on in the world, and this was something I didn't know about, but here is a Chinese Muslim navigator named Zheng He, who the map on the left shows the routes that he sailed between 1405 and 1433. The interesting thing is here's a picture of the ship that he used at the top, and down below is one of Columbus's boats. So he had a 400-foot vessel, 7 voyages, 317 ships, 28,000 men. Columbus's boats and crew 85 feet long, 86 to 89 men, so forth. And so it was amazing to me to see what was going on in the world and to understand it in relationship to things that I thought I knew about. Another key problem solver is Christopher Columbus. Here's a picture of Columbus. I also got a chance to spend some time in Spain, in the city where Columbus departed from, and to see what they are doing with the preservation of his legacy there. At one point he said, gold is the treasure, and he who possesses it does all he wishes in this world and succeeds in helping souls into paradise. And this is the friary where he left his son when he journeyed. And we all learned Columbus sailed the ocean blue in the year of 1492. It's fascinating for me to go back and see what the full story was. And he took sugar to the New World. And on the left, you see his interactions with Native Americans. But on the right, here is an image done by William Blake that represents mercantilism, Europe supported by Africa and America. So this is a real old depiction of what mercantilism was all about. So I'm trying to introduce the demand for labor. The products of slave labor included sugar, rum, rice, cotton, tobacco, coffee, and cocoa. The majority of enslaved Africans worked on plantations that produced these 7 commodities. More than half raised sugarcane. And something else I don't think we fully appreciate has to do with what I call the Africanization of the Americas. More African peoples than Europeans entered the Americas. Up to 1820, among the people who were transported across the Atlantic, Africans outnumbered Europeans by a ratio of over 3 to 1. Almost 8.4 million Africans as compared to 2.4 million Europeans. Again, that's just not something, we know, not something we think about, but represents part of what I think pivotal contribution of African people to the early history of the United States. This was a popular notion at one point in time, the triangular trade that has ships leaving the southern colonies with sugar, tobacco, and cotton going to Europe, and then taking manufactured goods and other rum and other things down to Africa and trading for Africans and taking it back to the New World. But in the last couple of decades, that view has did fall out of favor. And it has to do with the cliometric paradigm being used in economic history. So that's a story, that's why I'm emphasizing through all of this the importance of studying intellectual history. I might say when I did an early statement that I sent to a publisher, he says, this is a good piece, but why are you spending so much time talking about what other people have said? Why don't you just tell your story? And my response to him, what you don't understand is the way people have told the story is now a part of my story. So that encourages us to pay attention. I think at one point, I started to wear my bell bottoms today. I hope you remember what bell bottoms are. And the reason I was going to do that is I was going to say we should not treat our history and our theoretical paradigms like we do clothes. What's the prevailing fashion, right? And then you put that away. My view is that I kept my bell bottoms long enough, they'll come back into style. And that's what I want students to think about, our understanding of history and our theories of history and the debates of history. So sugar was important. Here is images from the Caribbean sugar production. This is a very serious topic, the impact of the slave trade or the slavery trade on the genocide in the areas of Spanish America. You see the numbers there on the right, from 18.8 million to 26 million, reduced to 1.1 million by 1605. Another important story that we need to spend more time on is Toussaint Louverture and his role. These are images by Jacob Lawrence. And so there's a way that you can work art into our teaching of history as well as music and so on. And so I really want to emphasize the importance of intellectual history. So on the left side is a book by Eric Williams, who taught at Howard University before he became Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. His book was called Capitalism and Slavery. Slavery was an economic institution of first importance. It had been the basis of Greek economy and built up the Roman Empire. In modern times, it provided the sugar for the tea and the coffee cups of the Western world. It produced the cotton to serve as a base for modern capitalism. It made the American South and the Caribbean islands. It's his comment. And on the right is another, probably more heralded now than when he was alive, Lorenzo Green's book on the Negro in colonial England. You will not find a better treatment of this than what he does in this book. And I mentioned some of the other works that can be used in this regard. And this brings me to something a point I want to make about our failure to study intellectual history. So this is Russell Menard, very prominent name in economic history. This is what he said in Callaloo. As is the case with, I suspect, many American historians of my generation, my introduction to Eric Williams was through his critics. I thought of him as an inventive but fundamentally wrong-headed historian who need not be taken seriously. So I avoided reading him until circumstances arose that made it impossible to avoid capitalism and slavery any longer. When I read the book straight through, I was enthralled and annoyed that I had not read it at the beginning of my graduate studies, hence this essay, which hopes to persuade others not to repeat my mistake. This guy was, I think, president of the Economic Historical Society, and he published the apology in Callaloo, not in one of the, mainline journals of the field of economic history. Callaloo is it's a conch sale. It's a journal. The journal specializes in the study of Afro-American lit. But I mean, and so you see that when people make these, admit to their failures to study something, it just doesn't resonate. It doesn't get the attention. So this is what I'm trying to point out here. So that's Act One. Act Two, from commerce to industrial revolution in Great Britain. I spent some time in Liverpool and Manchester. This is the Quarry Bank Mill in Manchester, which at one point was the mill that consumed more US-grown cotton, more slave-grown cotton, than any other mill in the world. So you'll see me juxtaposing on the left the manufacturing capacity, and on the right, cotton being grown. I want to keep the students, keep us considering that relationship. I also want to mention just briefly www.slavevoyages.org, because this is a phenomenal resource with more than 30,000 records of slave voyages. That's online. You can Google it tonight and look at it. And it allows us to study the slave trade in its particularities. So I often have students go and select a year or 2 years and compare. You can see, as I will show in just a second, where slaves were gathered from, who owned the ships that carried them, and so on. So that's a teaching resource. And how many slaves were traded and who were the traders, and you see here that it was, I think I have this on another slide, but it gives the nationalities of the different slave trading communities. It tells us where slaves came from in Africa, and you see clustered on the west coast of Africa here in this slide. And this is interesting. Where were slaves taken? Brazil got 41% of all of the slaves in the transatlantic slave trade. Bahia got 10.5, Jamaica 11.2. But at the very bottom, you see that the U.S. only got 3.8%. And that's a stunning statistic because it was not through the importation of enslaved Africans. It was more conditions which allowed their populations to grow naturally. And so this is one of the insights that can be gleaned from this particular resource. I also wanted to put what I call putting human faces on the slavery trade. So on the left, you see Timothy Fitch, Medford slave trader. merchant by profession. The cargoes of his ships included slaves, rum, molasses, and various other items. Rum and molasses from Medford were taken to West Africa and used to buy African slaves. So that's his story, and there is a wonderful collection at the Medford Historical Society. Some of it is online. And then on the right is Phyllis Wheatley. And their connection is that Phyllis Wheatley came over on a slave ship owned by Timothy Fitch. And one of the things that, this is Boston, you know the Phyllis Wheatley story, but she was once described as an uncultivated barbarian. And so it just tells us how enslaved Africans were viewed at this time, and probably too much in these times is the point that I think we would come to. And I'm not going to tell you the book I start writing when I realize more about Phyllis Wheatley, but she played a much bigger role in the American Revolution than we have given her credit for. We can talk more about that later. So getting to the story that we're mainly concerned about, here is and this is a European story, this is a Great Britain story. Here's weaving on hand looms on the left, and then on the right, the beginning of using machines. And you see somewhere in this building, the pulleys, located on rivers, like right out here. So this was a story that, and here, another reason that makes Marx controversial is the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in the minds of the Aboriginal populations, basically says signalizes the rosy dawn of capitalist production, and so on. And this probably is this is a more recent book. This is Joseph Inakori, Africans and the Industrial Revolution in England. And I'm not gonna, when you throw a pebble in the water and the ripples, right? That's a way of conceptualizing the multiplier effect, what economists call the multiplier effect. And so what you see when you probe into this deeper is the impact that the British Industrial Revolution began to have on other sectors of the economy. Is what this chart here tries to convey. And that one. Act 3, from colonial Africa to a new United States and its global cotton kingdom. Again, I'm juxtaposing slaves in the field and the founding fathers. We hold these truths to be self-evident and pushing students to think about what all of that means. That was important questions of industrial espionage in the early U.S. textile revolution. And particularly with Francis Cabot Lowell, who, he said he was ill, and I think the illness might have had something to do with the conflict between Great Britain and the United States. Anyway, he went to Europe, and he was such a well-respected businessman, he got permission to tour in Scotland and in Great Britain, I think, the textile mills. I mean, the U.S. founders were convinced that, we need to make more money, and maybe we should pay attention to the textile industry as a source of that. And so what they didn't know that he was a Harvard-trained mathematician with a photographic memory. So when he was walking around looking at that equipment, he was actually bringing back the insights as to how to build industrial technology for cotton textiles. And he actually, while in Europe, talked to a friend of his and said, this is what I'm wanting to do. When you go back to Boston and find me some land next to a river where we could do our thing. And we are in the place where that thing was done, because it was that scenario that led to the founding of this mill that we now stay in. But I simply listed some of the other technologies that were used. And it has an impact because, as I'll mention, I think, in the next one, Here is Arkwright's Cromford Mills, and it was in this textile mill with its power looms where Samuel Slater learned the skills that he learned. So when he came to the U.S. and hooked up with the Brown brothers in Pawtucket, this is what they were setting out trying to do. Now, so this all cascades into what I call the three waves of textile industrialization in the U.S. The first one, 1787, the Cabot Mill of Beverly, Massachusetts, quote, the earliest to manufacture cloth at private expense by means of power-driven machines. And George Washington actually, I think this is a quote from George Washington, who visited that mill very early on. So that's the first wave. The second, and this is where I mentioned Eli Whitney, because, you know, it was on Mulberry Grove in Savannah where he was visiting. He had just finished his law degree and he was going to study for the bar. He got ill on the ship, and Catherine Green, who was Nathaniel Green's wife, said, well, why don't you come to our plantation and recuperate? And there was a party with a lot of cotton growers there. And they were talking about if they could only find a machine to clean the cotton wool from the seed, they would be much more productive. And she said, well, why don't you take it up with this guy because he seems mechanically inclined. His father owned a pen factory north of Boston and was very familiar with technology. And so he went downtown, bought some bags of cotton, came back, went to the smokehouse, experimented, and came out with, this is the actual picture of the original cotton gin. Before 1793, one slave cleans 1 pound of cotton per day. With a hand-powered gin, one slave cleans 150 pounds per day. And once they added steam power, one slave could clean 1,000 pounds of cotton a day. So you can see how if we could grow more cotton, now we can gin more cotton. That's the story I'm trying to help us understand. So the second wave was the Brown brothers down near Providence in Pawtucket. On the left is Moses Brown, who became a Quaker and really decided not to participate in any more slave trading activities. They were founders of Brown University. And then on the right is Samuel Slater, I just mentioned, who Great Britain had a law that you couldn't leave, you couldn't immigrate if you knew anything about cotton textiles. So he went down and said, what's your occupation? Oh, I'm a carpenter. Oh, that dime a dozen, you go ahead. That was the person who brought the knowledge of industrialization of textiles to the United States. And here is the Brown Slater Mill on the Blackstone River. You see, it's still standing, it's on a waterway. The images here on the right really look like the pulleys and so on that you see there where they got power from. This is just north of Providence, Rhode Island. Pawtucket, Providence, Rhode Island. Yes. And then the third wave is where we stand right now. It's the introduction of the power loom, Francis Cabot Lowell and the Boston Associates around 1815. There are no pictures of Mr. Lowell as far as I know. Here is the silhouette that's often used to convey that. And I put here industrial wow. I had a lot of computer problems yesterday, and I get industrial espionage because it's these guys. I mean, first you have to recognize that the Beverly Mill was a Cabot Mill. So in the third wave, you have Francis Cabot Lowell. What's the thing? So dear old Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Cabots talk only to the Lowells and the Lowells talk only to God. Right? Right. So there's a connection there that you can find if you study the two between these different waves, because the earlier, particularly Cabot and the Browns, had collected a lot of technology trying to figure out how to industrialize the process. So that was some historical connections there. But my host was correct. This is the first time that raw cotton, grown by slaves in the South, could come into one side of this mill and be woven, be spun into yarn, and then woven in cloth using the power of the water wheels outside. And so that's what makes this such an important source of innovation in the Industrial Revolution. Also a story about farm girls who were recruited from the countryside to provide the labor in the early mills. Later on, they were so successful in this mill that they started looking for other mills, other sites on the rivers. And so this is how Lowell, Massachusetts came into being, I think. So here, this is, and I lived in Lowell Mill. I lived in the Massachusetts Mill at the intersection of the Merrimack and the Concord River, part of the Mala Mills. They relocated to Rome, Georgia in 1896, but in their heyday, they produced 1/7 of all of the textiles employed 1,393 people in 1903. And the bottom line of these 52 mills that call Lowell its home, they produced enough cotton cloth to go around the equator 2.5 times. And so that says something about the scale of this operation. And here is one of the big innovations of this process was this technology of damming up the river just before you get to Lowell, and then building canals that crisscross the city, and so the canals could power more mills. And it had a phenomenal impact on the rise of industrial capitalism in the US, not to mention innovations in corporate organization, in financing. You can look and see who was investing in some of these early mills and so on. And it also had an impact on cotton and slave labor. And again, you see this depiction of comparing 1790 and 1820 to the 1860s, and you see as cotton production spread, so did where slaves were being brought to work in the South. So that's the story that I'm trying to tell in this project. I haven't looked at the time. Am I good on time? Yeah. So it's a big story. I mean, I've been away from it for a while. I apologize for that. But the more I read it now, it's very timely. I waited, I didn't do it earlier, but this is not a bad time to be trying to share this story. So what I say here in closing is that, as I said earlier, I almost wore my bell-bottom pants today. I'm not a clothes horse, but I do have a pair I like for special occasions. I wanted to use my bell-bottoms to remind me and you that we cannot treat our history and the paradigms we use to study history like we treat our clothes. I wanted to reiterate the guidance of W.B. Du Bois in the concluding chapter of his classic book, Black Reconstruction in America, subtitled An Essay Toward a History of the Part Which Black Folk Played in the Attempt to Reconstruct Democracy in America, 1860 to 1880. And these were his words. But are these reasons of courtesy and philanthropy sufficient for denying truth? If history is going to be scientific, if the record of human history is going to be set down with that accuracy and faithfulness of detail which will allow its use as a measuring rod and guidepost for the future generations of nations, there must be set some standard of ethics in research and interpretation. If, on the other hand, we're going to use history for our pleasure and amusement, for inflating our national ego and giving us a false but pleasurable sense of accomplishment, then we must give up the idea of history either as a science or as an art using the results of science, and admit frankly that we are using a version of historic fact in order to influence and educate a new generation along the way we wish. And little did I know that today would be the day that the Supreme Court announced its ruling in affirmative action. But I think you hear and see what I've heard and seen in terms of history doesn't repeat itself, but it has echoes, or however you want to phrase it. We are still grappling with some of these same issues. And so I want to finish this book now because I hope that it can serve as a source of study. I'm very fascinated and excited by what I see my students doing. I mean, listen to the young people you hear interviewing behind this decision, you know, very smart, very articulate, and I'd like to think we're going to be in good hands as a society, and I hope this book provides some additional enlightenment to the generations that will come along. Thank you for your patience.
Will you take some questions?
Absolutely.
If you have questions, please ask for the microphone because this is being recorded, and if you don't speak into a mic, no one will hear you.
We've heard a lot about the AP history course in America. Do you know, is this any research of this kind of research being presented? Do you know? I haven't seen the course.
You know, I actually, at some place I had a mention of Governor DeSantis because Florida is at the very front of this attempt to not be scientific and fact-based with history. But his argument is that we should not be teaching history that makes people feel bad. And as one of my students said in a discussion, well, that's why we study history, so we won't repeat it. You know, and feeling bad might, but you know, and this is important because it's not based on an understanding of what we actually do in Afro studies. I mean, I don't go into class trying to make my students feel bad. I go into class trying to inspire them, educate them, excite them, you know, teach them to be critical thinkers, even if it means criticizing me. So that's what worries me, not so much about, I mean, that's what worries me about what we're seeing, because there are 10, 15, 20 states that have now adopted similar legislation. And we should be worried about that. We should be worried about that because it is leading a large group of people down the wrong path. And that wrong path meaning not a path where they can come to criticize what they need to criticize, but also be in dialogue with others who might disagree. You know, and out of that process comes, I would hope, enlightenment for all. I mean, you know, the controversy around the AP course, I was invited to be on the board of scholars that worked on that, and I was just tired and I think I wanted to get back to what I was doing here. But there were a lot of scholars who worked on that, but that is not the advice that Florida is following.
No, but I wondered, is there a piece of this history in that course, do you know?
You know what, I don't recall. My sense is, I don't recall that particular point. I think when I looked at it I was not thinking about this. Yeah. But it's online. I can send you the link if you need to.
I was wondering,
yeah.
The curriculum of this, anything around this, it would be.
Well, it's, I mean, my feeling is not so much what's in any textbook, because it doesn't appear to me that they are taking all of the work that scholars have done on this and related topics seriously. It's just, we have some parents complaining that my little daughter or my little son felt bad when slavery was talked about, and therefore we should not have this material in the curriculum. That's not the basis of deciding curriculum offerings. It's got to be based on something deeper than
Well,
that, I think.
sometimes the forbidden fruit makes people want something more. So maybe all the powerful might, you know.
Yes.
I just wanted to add this concept of making people feel bad. What happens is we don't allow the human to develop empathy. When you see an experience and you think something's wrong with that, that's horrible, that's not right, then you can develop some empathy and you can have a higher consciousness. But by saying, I don't want my child to feel bad, you end up not allowing a human to develop empathy for a situation, and it does repeat.
And I think what has fascinated me over the years as I study this is all the instances where you can actually develop empathy by studying what has happened in our history, you know, and it's, yeah, I agree with you. Yes.
I'm really inspired by the question mark in the column that you didn't have on the screen.
Right.
And I teach a little bit about globalization and fast fashion. And so I'm interested in the way in which our discarded clothing makes its way into like African landfills. So there are these huge piles of trash clothes that are just shipped overseas. And I wonder, maybe, I don't know if you know about this, but I was wondering, like, where does that fit in this question mark of like an Act 4 or something?
Well, I didn't know that. But that's why that question mark is there. And what always happens is that people come forward with, Dr. Bailey, I think we should add this, we should add that. And that's what I'm looking for. I think the other thing about what you just said is trying to deepen the interest in environmental issues, not just here, but globally. Just like we've done in other campaigns, I think having an environmental studies option in African American studies, you know, all of these represents opportunities to expose young people to some of the grand challenges that we face here and around the world. And so that's how I would seek to find more about, you know, and actually having in dialogue with people now about what an environmental studies certificate would look like in an Afro Studies program, that sort of thing. So I appreciate that. I'll go and look for more information on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was astonished a few years ago by the TV series Westworld at how we live by stories. And it has, for me, gotten to a point where I see anything, even what you're presenting here, as a story, and it becomes so difficult then to try to understand. I mean, the story that New Englanders who want to believe that industry and science is all powerful and it's the reason that we have wealth, they believe that story, and to them it's a very real story, and they can put that story together. And you are presenting a story here that also points out that there was a tremendous amount of labor that went behind what made all this happen. I guess I have a hard time teasing it apart.
Well, when I studied economics, land, labor, and capital were the three factors of production, and each one got a piece of the pie. Labor, profits, and so on, interest. And so I find it more fascinating to introduce students to this story and let them come back and tell me how they're picking it apart or how they're using it. I thought where you were headed with that is, I think, what led me to want to tell this as a 3-act play. I mean, it was really coming off of thinking about storytelling and thinking about narration. What I didn't mention today is it was actually in Boston. I was flying from Logan to DC for a meeting at Howard one night, and my flight got canceled, so I was back out there the next morning at 5 o'clock. And a guy was climbing. I was mad with the world because it was so early. Guy climbed over me, and I was not going to talk. I was going to sleep. Turned out to be a person who introduced me to, I think he was an incoming dean at Harvard. He introduced me to the work of Schachter, is his name, Professor Schachter, who's done phenomenal work on memory. And that sent me off on some studies to understand the research that was being done on individual memory and collective memory, and how that plays a role in what we shape curriculum around, how we can use that in our teaching. So that's where I thought you were headed. I mean, it really is a cross-disciplinary enterprise, a multidisciplinary enterprise. And we don't do the best job of teasing out the ways that these stories can be told and connected, and used to cajole, inspire, educate, so forth and so on. I mean, I'm not very dogmatic with this. I think that's what fascinates me about the young students out here commenting on the Supreme Court decision today. If you listen to them, some smart kids with a lot of thinking, bringing new concepts to bear on very troubling issues. So I have confidence in the students that I teach and the students some of you teach, that they're going to figure out some of this and come back with more compelling stories and approaches to help us see ourselves as human beings connected to each other in all kinds of ways, and figure out how we solve some of the grand challenges that we're facing in this society and that are being faced on a global level as well. Bob.
I have a story or two, but I'm going to skip the part of the story that deals with my involvement as an undergraduate at Harvard, agitating for the creation of what some now consider to be one of the premier departments in African American studies. And I'll fast forward to 1970. I graduated from college in '69. Fast forward to 1970, and a group of marvelous but puzzling and wonderful at the same time community college students, black students, who had organized themselves into what was essentially a gospel chorus. They called themselves the Umojo Elite Gospelaires, because somebody had been out to East Palo Alto and where Ron Karenga was talking about Umoja, but they were more familiar with Mojo, and so it became Umojo Elite Gospelaires. And the main thing that the Gospelaires were looking for was somebody to be their faculty advisor. But there were no black faculty at Tallahassee Community College. Mm-hmm. Both the administration and the students were equally racist, that they presumed that, well, of course, you would want to have a black advisor. And we don't have any black faculty, so you can't have the club. So the students, not to be outdone, shifted their demand to a demand for a black faculty member who would teach, who would introduce black history at the community college. Now this college was 5 years old, founded from scratch after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. So the head of the Division of Social Sciences, who had done his degree at Florida State University where I was working on mine, picked up the phone, called my major professor and said, do you have anybody? And my major professor, knowing that I was about to get married to a woman that had 2 children and was going to need the money, recommended me. And in the first day of class, well, some people came to class just out of curiosity. You know, they had heard that there was a disciple of Malcolm X that had been hired to teach the course, and they wanted to see. You know, they had heard that there was a Harvard Negro, and they wanted to see what a Harvard Negro looks like. But when we got down, one of the sticking points, which remains a sticking point, is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson. And, you know, a mature woman, not fresh out of high school, you know, I would assume that they had cookbook American history. So I said, I'm going to do the foil to cookbook American history. And so I talked about Jefferson's attitudes towards cities, Jefferson's attitudes toward blacks, as reflected in the notes on the state of Virginia. And this mature woman, who was from South Georgia, Thomasville area, says, well, you forgot to mention all about Jeffersonian democracy. And it was like, well, oh, I thought you knew that. And she finally asked, I want to know if this is going to be a history course or psychotherapy. I said, well, you know, now normal historian would run away from that, you know, oh no, this is history. But I said, I was loose enough to say, well, you know, probably for a number of years to come, it's going to be very difficult to tell the difference between the two. And, you know, I've assigned books that had excerpts from interviews with ex-slaves. And I told everybody that you're gotta pick one and read it aloud in the class and tell her why you picked it and what it, you know. And I've had people get up and go to the registrar's office to drop the course.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, this was not mass, you know.
That's what I'm getting at when I talk about interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary. There are so many ways to engage people in this discussion with civility, if I can put it like that. I mean, it doesn't have to be as fractious as it is, and we just need more people thinking about how we can all do a better job with very sensitive topics. I mean, the fact that you shared that from 1970, and it's almost the echoes in what we hear being discussed today, You know, we've just not, and we've steered people away from the discussion, and then you get something like what's going on in Florida today. You know, so it's no surprise that there are people in the U.S. who would, you know, the ostrich sticks their head in the dirt, but your butt's exposed. That's kind of what we're being encouraged to do, not pay attention to these important issues, you know, and trying to gather up more knowledge about how do we better teach it. You know, I've had kids to go through school, and, you know, a lot of us have had kids to go through school. We don't always collaborate with the teachers who are teaching our kids. One of my most exciting experiences when I lived in Cambridge was with my daughter who was in the 8th grade, her teacher, Marcia Baines, who was at Tobin. And I'll mention something else. This place is fascinating to me because I showed Phyllis Wheatley, right? But what I didn't say is that my daughter finished Longfellow School, and they had their 8th grade graduation on the steps of the Longfellow House, which is where Phyllis Wheatley met with George Washington as he was leaving town, you know, during the evacuation. And, you know, I tell students, what happened on the ground you were walking on, this place, you can hardly turn the corner where something didn't happen, right? And we don't do the best job, and that's what worries me. I'm getting it off my chest, but it's not, I'm concerned about the way the Supreme Court is talking about race. It's not about race, it's about lived human experience. Now, we've let people get away with talking about race with all of the problems that anthropologists point to about race, but that's a concept that people came up with. That's different from saying, how can I look at these chunks of lived human experience and do what I will with it? I mean, again, I'm not saying what people have to come away from it with, but we've not done the best job of that. And now we're in the throes of some deep stuff, unprepared, not sufficiently prepared, if you will, you know, to take this on together so that we come away with whatever we need to come away with. That's how I would put it. I mean, again, I'm not being dictatorial about what people should conclude by having a more fulsome understanding of this discussion we had today. In the middle of this place, which is so historic, I don't know about you, but I'm valuing on all of the machines, the history of technology that is in this room. I mean, we're going to talk about how we can take the story of this mill and get it into the hands of more students who, you know, want to learn about some stuff that could excite them. So that's my approach to how we should be open to the possibilities of solving this and be open to the ideas that any of us can bring forward to do a better job of it than we've done in the last, you know, I've been knowing Bob for a long time, so we have probably a 50-year history together. But that's what we're facing now. We got to double back on that and say, what have we learned? What can we use? What can we introduce students to? I said to somebody earlier that I had a student who took a course on the slave trade and came back to me and said, Dr. Bailey, I'm interested in the impact, what happened when copper sheathing was put on the bottom of ships, of slave ships. Did it create a more wholesome environment in the ship that would lower the mortality rate, right? That's what he had his engineering, whatever. I mean, kids come up with things that we have never thought about, you know. So I'm excited that they're going to read this book when I finish it soon. Yes.
In a little bit different direction, in the words of a famous Southern writer, William Faulkner, the past is never dead, hell, it's not even past.
Yeah. Having worked in Mississippi for 8 years,
Yep.
I got you.
And it sure as hell ain't dead in Mississippi.
Yeah, it's yeah. That's why I'm so troubled at the way the discussion in Florida is proceeding, because it's as if we don't have rich experience and powerful insights about how we can teach. You know, if I'm teaching such that it makes students, white students in my class uncomfortable, one, I want the class to be comfortable enough to them that they can bring that to me. You know, and I had a young man this semester said, I forget what the topic was, but he said, Dr. Bailey, I'm a white Christian nationalist. Bring it. Let's talk about that. And he did it in the class, and I really think all of the class benefited from hearing us. I was driving just a few days before, I was driving through Illinois, coming back to campus through a very rural part of the state. And I chuckled because it reminded me of where I'm from, you know, class of 33 kids in a segregated Georgia school. And we have a lot of kids growing up in racial isolation, if I can put it like that, in communities and in schools that are not diverse, and communities and schools not diverse. And so we have a responsibility to all of our young people to help them see the pieces of the story that we can introduce them to, and help them develop critical thinking skills so that they can make sense of it, just like you do your kids. And you know, you're not going to always be around to raise your kids, so you want to give them some moral values and some understandings that they can carry on. I take that responsibility as a teacher very seriously. And so I'm more troubled about how we are failing in doing the best job of that. That's what I'm saying, I guess. So, another question? Yes.
I see a natural follow-on to this kind of topic, a discussion of reparations, and especially like how the accumulated wealth over time needs to be redistributed to some of the people who were responsible for generating that wealth. Do you think that's something that you might address in your book?
Yeah. So Katrina Brown, who was in the family of, oh my goodness, I forget. It's a story of slave trading out of Bristol, Rhode Island. The DeWolf family, yes, thank you. I got a call from Katrina asking me, you know, when I got word that I'm never going to finish this book, I began to cooperate with people who were, and I was very excited about her trying to tell the story of her family and the slave trade. And she actually she organized a group of family members. She invited us to Providence, and we went to Bristol, and we saw the rum distillation mill that they had, and she organized a group of family members to travel from Rhode Island to Ghana, where her family's ships went to get slaves, back to the Caribbean, where they had a sugar plantation and cane, and then back to Bristol. And I think the story is a lot of the family cussed her out. You know, didn't, but but that piece, that film, Slavery in the Deep North, I think it's called, but Katrina Brown is her name, actually tells the story of the family's involvement in the slave trade, and then engages people prominent in the reparations discussion with members of the family and with others. And so that's a good model for, one model for how that topic can be engaged. I don't know if, some people want individual payouts to families based on certain criteria. Other people want support for institutions that are trying to provide more educational opportunities for young people, so forth and so on. But there are good opportunities, I think, and good resources to have a productive discussion around topics like that. So, Sandy Darity is a professor at William Darity at Duke. Has done the most recent book that I've seen on reparations. He's a very serious economist, MIT PhD, I think, or yeah, I think MIT PhD. But so there are serious efforts in this discussion of reparations. The California proposition was well considered and has evidence that they're bringing to bear on it. Same thing is true, I think, with Evanston, Illinois, at the city level. So this is a topic that there are ways to pursue it in a way that would be productive and instructive, I think. Yeah. I hope that helps. Yeah. That it?
Seems like it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.